So my talk today is going to concern the genre of Cli-Fi, paying particularly attention to this book, Parable of the Sower. So I thought we'd begin by digging into Cli-Fi, talking about the ways in which that term has gained traction, and then think about the particular questions that Parable of the Sower raises in terms of that. So Cli-Fi is a relatively recent term. Emerged around 2013 when people started to think about the ways in which we talk about anthropogenic climate crises. And it differs from sci-fi in particularly important ways. First of which is that not every book in Cli-Fi is science fiction. There's a wide variety of these. What I've got up here is just a snapshot of some of some of the texts that I consider Cli-Fi. And I'm just going to go through them real quick. This is not meant to be exhaustive by any means. More so just to give an understanding of how this developed. So the first is by an author named J.G. Ballard. Some of us might know his work. There's a movie came out a couple years ago called High Rise. He wrote the book based on that movie. He's also famous for a book called Empire of the Sun, which is about his time in China. But more importantly, I think for Cli-Fi, he's a science fiction writer. And these two books, The Drowned World and The Burning World, start to lay a groundwork of how we understand anthropogenic climate crises articulated in fiction. Not to say there wasn't stuff before this, but this is where we group Cli-Fi especially. The Drowned World concerns a climate crisis not of our own making. That is not solar radiation caused sea levels to rise and the precipitation cycle to be disrupted. And a scientist, much like in Ballard's work, goes through all kinds of hurdles to save the day. But there's a shift that happens between the drowned world and the burning world, in which in the burning world, it is of our own creation. We've trashed the oceans, and rain is non-existent. The ground is literally burning. So we see a important distinction there where it's not just, oh, something happened to us. No, we did this. This is our fault. And we see this taken up through a variety of texts, including Parable of the Sower, which I'll get to in a minute. But I want to skip past that for a minute and talk about Margaret Atwood. Professor Mission mentioned Handmaid's Tale. Margaret Atwood's also famous for this trilogy of what she calls a dystopian trilogy. It doesn't really have a name. That follows a circle of characters through a literally dystopian landscape. What's important about this for me, though, is that she doesn't consider this science fiction. She calls it speculative fiction. And her key distinction is that this is not a world unlike our own. This is something that could happen in our world. She also calls it a romance epic, which I kind of like, but she doesn't use the word science fiction at all there. As you can see now, climate fiction is bigger than just a small, relatively defined characteristics of hard science fiction. And then we come to more recent examples of Ndidi Okafor, who wrote a book called Who Fears Death, which is tremendous. If you seek this out. She is a Nigerian American author writing about the Sudan, and is post-apocalyptic in its scope. I don't want to say any more without kind of spoiling it. But we see that's a common thread throughout these things. I'm a person fascinated by apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic literature, and we see that often in climate fiction, regardless of how you approach it. And then finally, there's a book I'm still working through called The Water Knife. And I would characterize this as I don't want to say a political thriller, but definitely an economic thriller. There's a sense of disparity, economic disparity that is carried throughout this book. And again, it's not hard science fiction. This is a world like our own. But the heart of this talk is going to be about Parable of the Sower. And before we get into it, I want to point out the date here. I've got dates behind all of these. This was written in 1993. And I want us to bear this in mind as we start to think about the type of questions this raises, because that may not seem so far away. So, Parable of the Sower, we're going to kind of tear through this because there's a lot to cover in 15 minutes for this book. But it concerns, it's written from the perspective of a 15-year-old girl called Lauren Olamina. And we're going to follow 3 years of her life, from 24 to 2027. And it's written in the form of a diary. Or you can call it autobiography, but I think a diary is more apt there. And it's filtered through her perspective. So what do we know about Lauren Olamina? Well, she's 15 years old when the novel begins. And she lives in a walled community. You could call it a gated community, but there's literally walls. in Southern California called Robolito, I'm sorry, outside Los Angeles. So it's outside Los Angeles there. And her world is one of gunfire. There's constant gunfire every night. There's food shortages. Even having enough to eat is a concern. So we see community gardens here, not in the sense of like this is a fun garden to have, but this is really a subsistence garden. And what they're growing is not almonds. Right? They're not growing water-sensitive crops, and we'll talk about water in a minute. They're growing acorns. They're growing citrus fruits, anything they can kind of grab to survive here. She's one of several children in her family. Her father, speaking here, we'll talk a minute about him, is a reverend. He's a Southern Baptist preacher. He's also a college professor who goes to campus 1 day a week. So, turn faculty 1 day a week, it's nice. Partly because leaving the outside of the compound is exceedingly dangerous. There's no gasoline, so they ride bikes everywhere. So he's taking his life in his hands illegally every time he leaves. As I just said, she's one of several children. But what makes Laura distinct is that she has a trait called hyperempathy. And that's defined, or they call it hyperempathy syndrome. She feels everybody else's pain. When they're hurt, she feels it. Not just like, oh, I feel bad for you. She literally embodies that pain. Her younger siblings used to trick her by putting red paint on their arm to act like she was bleeding, and she would actually bleed. This becomes increasingly important as we look about Laura leaving the compound and forcing to face enemies and get engaged in physical fights. But I think it raises a question that I want to consider with this book is, what does it mean about this world where having empathy makes you vulnerable? I think it's something we think about with climate fiction, especially as we start to look at other things here. So this is Laura's dad speaking. I don't know whether the good times are coming back again, but I know it won't matter if we don't survive these times. Laura and her dad have a contentious relationship. We'll talk about Laura's religion, Earthseed, which she's studying in a little bit here, but Laura's dad often is a voice of, I'm going to call them boomers, but it's sort of like this idea that maybe the good times will come back again. And he's honestly a voice of reason in that sense. We see a stronger other characters who believe the good times are coming back and it's going to be fine. But let's talk a little bit more about these times. This is Laura speaking to her friend named Joe, who's one of her confidants early in the novel. Tornadoes are smashing the hell out of Alabama, Kentucky, Tennessee, and 2 or 3 other states. 300 people dead so far. And there's a blizzard freezing the northern Midwest, killing even more people. In New York and New Jersey, a measles epidemic is killing people. Measles. In that last bit there, I included only to think that she couldn't believe that measles was coming back. But as we know, there's a measles outbreak in the Pacific Northwest last year. Again, this is 1993, folks. So the world outside of their compound, again, this is a novel very much of California, but it addresses the United States as a whole, is beset by erratic weather patterns. At the same time there's tornadoes happening, there are blizzards happening, and there's hurricanes in the Gulf. This whole land is torn apart by climate change. It's not really fully defined. We don't know what precipitated this, or just precipitated this sort of social collapse, only that it happened, and we'll definitely deal with the fallout. This novel is not so much interested in how we got here, but rather how do we survive this. And I think as you see the questions this raises, it'll become more and more clear that Butler is trying to offer a solution of some sort. So I've mentioned some of the other threats that we face here. There's gun-wielding folks everywhere. There's a drug called pyro or ro, or just O, which, when imbibing it, allows the user to feel an euphoric experience when looking at fire, akin to a sexual release. So this is rampant. So there's fire everywhere, which becomes crucial when you consider the landscape of this of California, which there's no water. Water is a key strategic resource for our life, but also in this world. This is them speaking about a recent rainstorm that happened, and Laura wondering if it's ever going to happen again. They're talking about, she's writing in her diary about the sort of houses they have, and this is speaking about roof repair. Yet no one has extra money for something not essential as roof repair. If it only rains 6 or 7 years, why bother? And that is not an exaggeration. It rains 6 or 7 years in Southern California. So water then becomes a precious commodity that people kill over, literally kill over. The idea of showering every day is gone. In fact, when you leave the compound, you have to rub dirt on yourself to make sure that people think you're dirty, because water becomes a sign of wealth. Which speaks to an economic disparity that we'll see articulated in another quote I want to show. But also, water is being sold. Not since we pay the city because we get stuff out of the tap, but there's water sellers, which will vary in degree of water cleanliness. So access of water becomes a key threat here. Along with that becomes access of, the other threat is fire. And we see this played out throughout the novel. We mentioned that fire is running rampant over Southern California, which in 1993, yeah, it seems like there were some fires and we were concerned by them, but every year now there's horrific fires in Southern California. The Amazon's on fire. This is something that's happening now. But for Laura in 2020, this is 2025, this is a key everyday consideration. So I mentioned that, I've been hammering the point home, that this world is like our world. I would argue that Butler may consider this speculative fiction in the sense that this is something that could happen. There's a political dimension to all of this as well. There's a new president by the name of Christopher Donner, who's running on the platform of scrapping the space program, which Laura adores. She thinks that space is a way to save us in a way that one good thing she says that happened in the last 20 years. But Donner he wants to scrap that because he thinks it's a waste of money. He's running on a platform essentially of let's get back to the good old days. And I think that rhetoric here, that this is again 1993, we see reflected in a lot of what's happening in current political climates. And again, this is Joe speaking to Laura about her own family, which is believes much more strongly in the idea that the good times will come back again. My mother is hoping this new guy, President Donner, will start to just get us back to normal. And if I just click these things, my mother is hoping this new guy, President Trump, will make America great again. We can see that same rhetoric reflected. Even 1983, Butler was showing us that these things might occur. And this is also a crucial aspect here. I mentioned the economic disparity that happens in this novel. As resources become less and less frequent, companies move in and take advantage of this. We see a return to debt slavery, often articulated, and people working for companies and getting company script instead of actual money. So the companies have a cheap, often always there present source of labor, providing room and board, which is really just a cot and access to dirty water in exchange for labor. And this is a particular point in the novel where this company called KSF moves in and buys a whole town in the Southern California called Olivar, because that town sits on an aquifer, and they're planning to sell that water. So this is Laura speaking to Joe again, but I want to kind of situate this maybe in our current climate. Then the people of KSF showed up. After many promises, much haggling, suspicion, fear, and hope, legal wrangling, the voters and officials of Olivar permitted the town to be taken over, bought out, privatized. So let's click on a few things here. Change some things. Then the people of Nestle showed up. After much dispute, blah, blah, blah. The governments of Michigan and Florida permitted the town to be taken over, bought out, privatized. Permitted the water supply to be privatized. We see this continually happening right now with Nestle in Florida. Right? They're trying to pump out $1.1 million, 1.1 million gallons a day of water from a Florida aquifer near the Santa Fe River, and then sell it back to us as bottled water. Maybe not as brutal as KSF, but maybe not so great either. So I'm going to fast forward a little bit here. One thing I do want to say about this, so this is from Earthseed. This is a religion that Laura is proselytizing, that God has changed, changes adaptability. The people resistant to this, and what Butler was saying, are the people older than her. This last bit there, God has changed, I said. Olamina doesn't mean anything. It means everything. Everything. The person that says it doesn't mean anything is her older lover named Bokolo. And he's much older. He's 57. So he's not buying into this, whereas Laura and her cohorts are. because they have to, because this is their world. They have to live in this world. This is Butler speaking about how she envisions Laura coming into her own, building her own community. When Olamina's birth community is destroyed, she begins to build another. She doesn't know at first that is what she's doing, and she's afraid, terrified of potentially dangerous strangers. But she learns to reach out in spite of her fear, to choose the best people she can and bring them together. She believes her only dependable help must come from ourselves and from one another. She learns to become an activist. And I think this is Butler showing a way out of this. That we can't be like our predecessors. We can't just sit behind wall communities, which eventually destroyed and gunned down. We have to find a new way. And for Laura, it's building a community based on change, based on self-sufficiency, and based on adaptability. The last thing I want to say, this is Laura speaking again, early on in the book, when she kind of realizes that she is called to spread this idea of change and adaptability. This connects, I think, with what Tara was saying with that poem, Sow Your Seed, I think, right?
Throw yourself like a seed.
Throw yourself like a seed. And we see earth seed here. I am earth seed. Anyone can be. Someday, I think there will be a lot of us. And I think we'll have to seed ourselves further and further from this dying place. For Laura, that's the stars. But she's starting in Northern California. She's starting in Humboldt County. Thanks.
We'd like to take a few questions.
Sure. I know I kind of rushed through it. If anyone wants to know more about this. Sorry. Tell me your name. Sorry. Hey.
I guess I really like how you introduced the concept of Cli-Fi because it's really true to like some of my own projects I'm trying to write. What would you kind of recommend for somebody who wants to kind of provide activism through writing Cli-Fi?
That's a good question, and one that I don't think I have a good answer to necessarily. I think looking at Butler is a great example of that. She's got a notebook after this called Parable of the Talents, which is one like duology, I would say. But also Atwood. I think Atwood is somebody who is in the current. I'm sorry, you're asking for like examples, or are you asking for what to do?
Kind of like advice, I guess.
Right. I think both Atwood and Butler don't ignore the present, right? But we're focusing on not just like this world sucks, what can we do, but how do we work our way out of it somewhat. That was kind of a crap answer to your question, but that's what I got. Other questions?
So,
David.
I was having an exchange with my friend Alison Staudinger, who spoke earlier about summer reading and stuff, and I was reading a lot of really bleak things, and I thought, what the heck, I'm going to read Octavia Butler.
Yeah, good idea, pal.
So I read Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, and one reason I chose that is I had been seeing some references to the Earthseed teachings
right.
by some activists, the people who were clearly inspired by some of the ideas in the book. And I'm just curious if you see those two books together as being hopeful in some way or inspiring. I mean, because they're also to the, I mean, I'll say, you know, pretty much to the end, pretty bleak.
Yes, they're brutal.
Yeah.
I think it depends what day you get me.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Sometimes I'm like, the Alamedas of this world are going to save us. And other times I'm like, I don't want to spoil anything from Parable of Talents, but it's going to get so much worse. But there's another book in the series called Fledgling, which was originally supposed to be the third, called Parable of the Trickster. But she had writer's block and couldn't finish it. But Fledgling also picks up some of these same ideas. It's not, technically, it's like, I would call it a spiritual successor more than anything.
Okay.
Yeah, it's bleak. But then again, the Amazon's on fire. I don't know.
Yeah.
I think, but again, sometimes when people are out there fearless and just doing the work, I know I'll be okay with that, I guess. But that's today. Maybe I'm just feeling good about people finding solutions today.